welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome Shanthi Sekaran to Story Hour. And I should tell you also, for those of you who haven't been here recently, this is our last season of Story Hour. We've been doing it for 9 years, I think. And so we're ending it with the student reading. So Shanthi is actually our last official reader, the last one in the many seasons. There'll be other events in this room, book events and so forth, that will keep on going on. But do come to the student reading if you are able to. So Shanthi was born in Sacramento, the daughter of two physicians who came to the United States from India in the 1960s. She's a Cal graduate. She was an English major in the next building over, and she later also from Cal obtained a master's degree in South Asian studies. But the writing bug had bitten early. When she was 7, she wrote a novel titled California Gypsy, about a gypsy who ends up in California and the girl who befriends her. So she then did obtain an MFA from the writing seminars at Johns Hopkins University, and some years later, in 2009, she published her first novel, The Prayer Room. The room of the title refers to a puja room filled with statues of Hindu gods and goddesses in suburban Sacramento, which becomes a place of repose and meditation for an Indian woman named Viji. Viji is in the United States because of an impulsive marriage to an English PhD student who happens to be in India to work on a dissertation about Indian temples. Viji's act of rebellion leads her on a lifelong journey into a very unknown land, the United States. In the San Francisco Chronicle, Charles Matthews described The Prayer Room as engagingly written and sharply observed, full of lovely and accomplished things, including some breathtaking observations of place. Shanthi's second novel, Lucky Boy, was just published in January this year and was instantly pronounced Amazon's Read of the Month, best read of the month. In the first few pages of Lucky Boy, a young Mexican woman named Soli makes the perilous journey north from her impoverished village to the promised land of the United States. She does survive the dangerous trek, but arrives pregnant, the result of a liaison with a charismatic young man who she meets along the way. She struggles to adapt and gives birth to a son, but a few months later is arrested and jailed as an illegal immigrant. Her son is taken into the foster care system and then adopted by a successful young Indian-American couple, Kavya and Rishi Reddy. The Kirkus Review observed about the novel in a starred review, the heartbreaking journeys of these two women, that is Kavya and Soli, bound by love of the baby boy, are the center of the novel. Sekaran is a master of drawing detailed, richly layered characters and relationships. Here are the subtly nuanced lines of love and expectation between parents and children. Here, too, are moments of great depth and insight, a superbly crafted and engrossing novel. In the New York Times, Carmela Siuraru wrote, "The plight of undocumented immigrants is nothing new, but in our current political moment, the issue has acquired a fresh urgency. In pitting two very different kinds of immigrants against each other, one comfortably assimilated, the other helpless in every sense, Sekaran offers a brilliantly agonizing setup, an exceptional novel." And I can testify to the accuracy of the comfortably assimilated group. I think the novel is a brilliant observation of the successful immigrant, of the Indian diaspora in its more successful stages and varieties. Shanthi teaches creative writing at the California College of the Arts. She lives here in Berkeley with her husband and 2 children. Please join me in welcoming her to Story Hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikram, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming out to this, our final official story hour. Not official, I guess, non-student story hour. And thank you also for giving a summary of my book. For some reason, that's my least favorite thing to have to do. I find it really difficult. And also, I should say that to say that I wrote a novel when I was 7 is a slight stretch. I think I wrote like 2 pages and realized that I was wholly unqualified to be writing about a gypsy in California. And I think sometimes realizing that you're not ready to write a novel is as important as actually writing the novel. So, but I did attempt it. So I'm going to talk a little bit and read a little bit and we'll see where we go from there. And then I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So Lucky Boy, this is a book that I've been working on for years. It began for me in 2010. And on a night in 2010, I was driving home from work and listening to NPR. And I heard a story of a Guatemalan woman who was in detention. So she was in detention, and her son was being adopted away from her by an American couple. And as the story came out back in 2010, she was sort of going through the appeals courts, trying to fight this adoption, trying to get her son back as she was under threat of being deported. So I heard this story. Her name was Encarnacion Bail. I heard Encarnacion's story, and the first thing I wanted was to know more. You know, you get a radio report that's about 3 minutes long. And what I wanted to know is what people were thinking, what the adoptive parents were thinking, what this woman was going through, what would eventually happen to the boy who was about 1.5 years when he was adopted. So that's where I began with this. And it was an extraordinary story. It was an extraordinary, agonizing, as the New York Times said, situation. And because I'm a fiction writer and not a journalist, my way of understanding such situations is to sort of make things up, to put characters in a similar situation and start writing and start discovering the inside of that story. So as realist fiction writers, what we often have to do is take ordinary moments and find the extraordinary within them. What I had to do with this was to take this extraordinary situation and find what was ordinary about it, really dig in and find the everyday elements of a situation, like Encarnacion's, and then like my character, Soli's. So I'll begin with Soli. Soli is a young Mexican woman who I created for this story. And she comes from Oaxaca in Mexico. And I was faced with writing the story of a woman whose life was very, very different from my own. I'm not undocumented. I'm not from Mexico. I was born here to Indian parents. And so I was faced with this task of doing this thing that I'd never thought I could do. So what I did first was research, of course. I watched some documentaries. I read some oral histories. I learned about detention centers. I talked to immigration policy people. I did everything I could to sort of get the baseline facts. And just to give you some basic facts, right now in America, we have about 11 million undocumented immigrants. About 8 million of them are in our workforce. And about 5 million children in the United States have at least one undocumented parent. So that's the magnitude of the situation right now, just to give you an idea. So in finding the ordinary in the extraordinary, I had to begin asking myself some of these journalistic questions, like who, why, what, where. One of the first questions I asked myself was why people are coming across the border from south of the border. What economic motivators would cause someone to leave everything that they had and try to make it to America. And then the next question that I had to really look into was how? How did they make it up here? That's where a lot of my research really focused. It's on that journey up through Mexico. And often, the border itself is a treacherous place, but often it's making one's way up through Mexico that is the most dangerous, both for Mexicans and for people from countries south of the Mexican border. So one thing that I researched was the freight trains that make their way up through Mexico. And what people do, if you haven't learned about this already, what people do is they will ride on the tops of these freight trains, and it's illegal, it's not allowed. People do it, the police, the government, they sort of turn the other cheek, they sort of turn the other way. So I learned a lot about this and sort of what that journey was like, and that's what I'm going to read about first. So a couple things you need to know is Soli is our main character. And she's in a camp, and there are these camps that exist sort of along the way, sort of literally on the side of these train tracks. So she finds herself in this camp, and there's a group, I don't think you need to know this for this section, but anyway, there's a group called Grupo Beta, and they help migrants along. They help them bandage their feet, they give them food, they give them bathrooms, just hygiene facilities, whatever sort of helps them stay healthy and alive along the way. So Soli is in one of these camps, and she's trying to get away from the man who she was supposed to go up north with. The plan was for him to take her along, and then she realizes that that's really not going to be a good idea. So she finds a young man named Checo. And here's what happens with Checo and the trains, or just the beginning of it. Soli made a decision. This was the voice for her. She would stick with this voice. It belonged to a young man, thin and capable. From his head rose a hurricane of hair pushed back with a headband. She'd never seen anyone like him. He couldn't have been much older than her, 20 maybe. He sat in a cluster of men and boys. He squinted into the sun, shook his head, threw his hands in the air as he spoke. Thin ropes circled his wrists. His name was Checo. She could tell this much from where she sat. Checo wasn't scared, and she was. He seemed to know what he was doing, and she hadn't a clue. But for all her ignorance, she knew she'd have to make her own move. The key, she sensed, was to pretend she didn't care. Take him or leave him, whoever he was, this man who radiated promise. He stood at the edge of the camp now, staring down the train tracks when she walked to his side. He saw her, nodded. Get enough to eat? Sure. She peered down the tracks herself and saw nothing but quavers of heat. You headed to the States? She asked at last. He smirked. I sure am, señorita. And you, Japan? She had no reply to this, so she mustered her courage and said, I think I'll come along with you. This earned an outright yelp of glee. The man doubled over, hands on knees, laughing. Soli stared. She'd never made a person laugh like this before. Other travelers turned to watch them. A few of his friends gathered round, looking from Soli to the man and back. Soli turned to leave. Wait, he held up a hand, waved a finger at her. Don't go, he said. Okay. Okay, what? If that's what you want, you can come with us. He smiled for real then. A small boy stepped forward from his group of friends, looked Soli up and down. Can you ride trains? He whacked her on the arm. You ever ride a train before? Soli gazed at the boy, rubbed at her arm. I can ride a train, she said. Anyone could ride a train, she thought. Soli began to understand that getting on a freight train when you haven't been invited wasn't a wise thing to do. Checo explained it to her beforehand. You wait for the train to start moving, you run like hell, and you climb on, he said. If you fall, you're carne molida. Why can't you get on before it starts? You'll get caught, he said. Now listen, you run alongside it and catch up to one of those ladders on the side. See there? You run, you climb, and you get on the train. You go first and I'll come up behind you. Okay. I won't be able to pull you up, he said. You'll have to do that yourself. You got strong arms? I don't. He clasped her arm where the muscle should have been. Well, you're light. You'll be fine. Give me your backpack. I'll carry it. Later, he put the backpack down and looked straight into Soli's eyes. You'll have to keep up with us, okay? He cupped her elbow. Don't get left behind. Running for a train was easy enough because she had a goal in mind, and that goal made her forget the raw skin between her thighs, the pounding in her feet and knees. It was a race she had a chance of winning. Pulling herself onto a moving train was something else. It was then that she began to doubt herself, when she realized just how weak her arms were, how fickle the elbows. The train gnashed its wheels at her, sent the sound of metal on metal right up through her bones. and into the marrow. So that's Soli just beginning to get onto a freight train. As I wrote this, that was sort of from the very beginning of my research and my writing. And very quickly, I realized that I kind of had no idea really what I was doing. I mean, I was creating this woman who came from Mexico. I'd never really been to Mexico outside of like a beach resort once, with my parents. So I had no idea where she was from. I'd made up sort of a town for her, made up a name for it, had no idea what region she was from, what that meant for someone from any particular region. So I had to get down there, I realized. I had to get to Mexico. And the opportunity presented itself at a party, as many opportunities present themselves. I met a writer who ran an artist's residency with himself and his partner. And that was in Oaxaca. And so it took me a few months and it took me some mustering of courage and finances, but I finally got down there for a couple weeks, and I was in Oaxaca, in this little town outside of the main city. And I was learning a lot. A lot of what I did was about just cataloging physical detail and learning about what was important to the people, what the roads looked like, why certain roads were blocked off, what it meant when there was a protest in the middle of the city, and what people were protesting about. One of the things that I learned was that every town around there has two names. So they'll have the name of a Catholic saint, and then they'll have an indigenous name. The little town where I was staying was called San Jeronimo Tlaquechuaya. And the town that I made up for Soli was called Santa Clara Popocalco. So Santa Clara is Saint Clair, Santa Clara. And Popocalco is an indigenous word, and this is where Google comes in handy. So I'm pretty proud of myself. Well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be proud, but I looked up sort of indigenous words from the region, and I put together Popocalco, which means house of smoke. And I like to talk about that because I couldn't find a way to fit it into the book, and I like that detail. So for Soli, what I had to really do was create in her as a character an urge to leave this place that was safe, this place that she called home. She wasn't running with her life in her hands. She wasn't running for her life. Really, she wanted a world that was larger than the world that she had. She wanted opportunity. She wanted a more dynamic future than the one that she foresaw for herself. And that's something I could talk about later. I feel like we expect immigrants now to either be highly skilled techies or to be running from a militia. And there's a lot that's in between. So here's Soli. I felt that it was really important to give her a home that felt real, because often we think of immigrants in our space, and I wanted to give her her own space so that it was clear what she was leaving. So here's a little bit about Popocalco. Never had she seen so many people here in her little village. Most days it seemed the world had forgotten Santa Clara Popocalco. It was a sort of place that existed only because no larger town had cared to claim it. It lay dry and hollow, anchored to this earth by the Sierra Norte to the east, Oaxaca City to the west. Every morning, a cold front rolled in from a distant shore. It collided with the hillside and smothered the valley in fog that smelled faintly, sweetly of corn. Every afternoon, the sun burned through the fog and houses regained their low and addled forms. Popocalco offered no work, only the growing and eating of a few stalks of corn. When the money left, the people followed, except for the very poor and very old, who still grew crops to feed themselves and sell in local markets, who gurgled through the village square every morning, and in the evenings visiting the church, nodding to the faces, always the same faces, and napping and cooking and eating and washing, sweeping their front steps each day, not exactly waiting to die, Soli believed, but not quite living either. For too long, she'd pushed away the thought of leaving. Papi. She was his only one. and Mama. Mama would crawl into bed and never crawl out. But decay had spread like the valley fog until it found its way to Soli. She'd breathed so much of it in that she couldn't breathe it out again. She was filling up with silence and heavy bones. She was 18. And then the letter from Sylvia. Inside, somewhere between her chest and chin, a seed split open to the sun, and she began to wonder, could she? And how? And eventually when and why not? And how soon? Her life lay elsewhere. If she stayed in Popocalco, she'd be staying for them, the gentle old souls, her mother and father and the sullen corn, watching all those lives wind down to their modest end. So that's Soli back home. She eventually gets to Berkeley, California. I'm not going to give away what happens in the middle there, but she gets to Berkeley, California. And she finds that she's pregnant. And she's living with her cousin, and her cousin finds her a pretty good job. Her job is to be working for this family called the Cassidys, who live in the Gourmet Ghetto. And she goes there every day and sort of is a housekeeper for them. It's a steady job. It's comparatively not a bad one. So this is our last little bit of Soli. This is Soli when she arrives at the Cassidy house. One thing I really enjoyed about writing about Berkeley is, I've lived here for many years, on and off. And it's such an interesting place. It's full of so many contradictions. It's a contradiction of privilege and compassion and the utmost sincerity combined with a certain blindness. And just a simple enjoyment of life. I feel like people here, they enjoy the sun. They enjoy good, simple food. They enjoy having people around them. And that is somehow combined with a sort of interesting uptightness, I find sometimes. I find that there's this phenomenon of the uptight hippie, that's what I call it anyway. Like you're in the cheese board and someone's like getting really tense because you're not standing in line correctly and that sort of thing. So here's Soli in Berkeley. The next morning, Soli got off the bus at a corner of the city canopied by oaks. People streamed by in pairs and trios. Soon, Soli would know this corner well. She would know it was Shattuck and Vine, that in one direction lay the university, in another the water, and behind her the hills. Around her spread the Gourmet Ghetto. Let's make one thing clear. Soli had seen ghettos. This was no ghetto. All she saw were women pushing their babies in strollers, a few fathers who looked like movie stars, the young on bicycles and the old in sun hats seated at cafe tables. The salty warmth of baking bread drifted over the rooftops to nuzzle her, like a cat on her shoulder, the moment she stepped off the bus. In Popocalco, the young men had left. The town rattled with their absence, and only the newly built houses gave evidence that they still existed somewhere. But Soli remembered them, and the roads stretching empty remembered them too. In Berkeley, there were people everywhere. Students finished their degrees and dragged their feet. People left their high-paying careers and retired here. Streaming in constantly were the academics and vagrants of the world, with their doctorates and dogs on strings. Buying bungalows and hybrid cars were the young families who had good jobs and helpful parents and custom-built child-carrying bicycles. They all stayed and lived and took up room. They pulsed down the sidewalks and pushed into lanes of traffic. They stood in line at bakeries and pizzerias and surged through outdoor farmers' markets as if fresh herbs and homemade kombucha were all that could matter in the world. She was learning that in Berkeley, even beautiful things were small. From the street, the Cassidy house was nowhere to be seen. It hid somewhere in a tumble of vines and crimson trumpet blossoms. She fought through the brush until she reached the front door, crossed herself, and kissed her thumb. Somewhere in that lovely mess of vines, she found a doorbell, which she rang. A rush of toenails on the floor, sharp barking, someone scolding a dog. The door opened, and before her stood Toto, the elephantine dog, a lady, and a little girl. The woman struggling to grab the dog by the collar was tall with red hair. From where she stood, Soli could smell the coffee on her breath and the sweet waft of a blossom that she recognized but could not name. The woman caught hold of the dog and dragged him into the house, calling, "Come in and shut the door." The little girl's name couldn't be pronounced. The mother said it easily enough, but it sat like a fuzz on Soli's tongue. The mother said it twice more and spelled it, Saoirse, which didn't help. Soli worried for the little girl and her strange little name. "It's Celtic," Mrs. Cassidy told her, "traditionally Irish. It's part of our heritage. We want her to be in touch with who she is, you know?" In Popocalco, women had names their grandmothers had and their grandmothers before them. Only politicians spoke of heritage. She would call the little girl Mija. The Cassidys lived in a bungalow that smelled of green plants and wood. That first morning, it was plain to see why they wanted her every day. This house would need a strict daily purge just to keep it from soiling itself. The bookshelves were piled with ceramic trinkets, things that seemed to be made by school children, but which she found out later were really quite expensive. The kitchen was more of a jungle than a kitchen, with plants that hung from the ceiling and pots of herbs crowding the windowsill above the sink. The sink was a work of art, a surrealist sculpture of balancing pots and chicken carcasses. Dishes upon dishes upon dishes, a leaning tower of refuse. It smelled of old food and damp cloth. Soli's stomach lurched, and she feared she would be sick right there, that this house and the baby inside would not be getting along. From the kitchen, the signora led her to the master bedroom. "Every day," she said. "Every day, yes?" Soli nodded. The signora pointed to the bed, the carpet, the dresser. "Questo," she said. "Questo e questo, ma no questo." She pointed to the closet. "See?" Soli followed her finger, piecing together what seemed to be a mélange of Spanish and Italian, when the signora gave up and switched to English. "I'm sorry about the mess, Soli. You can see why we need you. Brett's been in Hong Kong for a month and things are getting just completely wacky. I'm not a messy person." Soli smiled. "But you can see that there's a lot of work to do, so take your time, help yourself to anything in the kitchen, okay? Mi casa es su casa, or whatever." She scoffed at herself and left the room. "Thank you," was all Soli could say. She sniffed a curtain and frowned. This was most certainly not her casa. Okay, so that's Soli. Soli's story moves on from there. Just to give you a quick sort of idea of the other side of this story. We have a woman named Kavya and her husband, Rishi. And I required a lot less research for these two. Kavya and Rishi are Indian American, much like me. They both went to Berkeley. They live in Berkeley. A big part of Kavya's life was about coming to terms with who she was in the face of great ambition on the part of her parents. So who she was in college was not a pre-med student or an engineering student. She was an activist. Someone asked me once what her major was, and actually I have no idea what her major was in college. But she was an activist, and she loves food, and so she became a chef. First in Berkeley, and then when we join her in the story, in a sorority in Berkeley. She's a sorority chef. And the main thing I want to say about Kavya and Rishi, this sort of takes me back to when I was trying to get this book published. So I went through maybe 2 or 3 rounds of just outright rejection from publishers with this book. And at one point, sort of halfway through this, I got very cynical, and I thought, well, maybe I should just change all my Indian characters to white people, and then that'll make this book more palatable to the publishing industry. And when I told my agent this, she said, no, you can't do that, because this book is about how immigrants of different types interact on American soil. And I'd never really thought of it that way. One thing that the one thing that I thought that this was about was Soli's story, and I thought that Kavya was just sort of there as the default other side. But then I did start to think more and more about this, this dynamic. This is a book about immigrants of different types. And when I started thinking about it in that way, we had people like Soli, we have people like Kavya and Rishi, and then we have people who've been coming recently to California, people in Silicon Valley. So I drew in a Silicon Valley element as well. I'm not going to read the Silicon Valley part, but what I did have to think about was how I was going to integrate Silicon Valley into this book that was essentially about Berkeley and Mexico. You can't really, when you write a book, you can't really just you can't cherry pick things that don't really belong together and plunk them into one manuscript and expect it to work. So I had to figure out what it was about Silicon Valley that spoke to the rest of the story. So before I answer that question, I'm going to read a little bit of Kavya and Rishi's story. They have this sort of quintessentially beautiful Berkeley life, but they have one central struggle, which you'll hear about here. And then I'll wrap up and we can take some questions. Kavya had moved to Berkeley 18 years earlier for college. She had graduated, traveled, become a chef, and married Rishi in that order. She found a bungalow with craftsman moldings and light fixtures. It sat wood-shingled at the end of a short drive just off Shattuck Avenue, within wafting distance of bakeries and storied restaurants. After they bought their house, a small miracle possible with their parents' help, they'd walked hand in hand through a horticultural nursery to pick out plants, wandering among aisles of miniature fruit trees and exotic blooms. On Sunday mornings, they lay naked in bed. They often slept clothed against the cool Berkeley nights, then stripped down for the pleasure of a lazy morning. They spent hours individually wrapped, Rishi in the bedsheet and Kavya in the quilt, dozing and staring at each other and checking their email until the prospect of skin on skin and plunging one into the other grew too electric to resist. When they remembered to, they went for head massages at the Sunday farmers market. With Rishi, Kavya took bike rides through the low hills. She walked to the movie theater. She walked to the shops. She walked and walked. She cycled. She flipped off cars that got too close to her on narrow and overparked roads. She glared at SUVs. She grew calf muscles that no longer fit her jeans. Kavya rose to the helm of her own storied restaurant. For a while, it was all she needed, the comforting method of pizza making, the smell of baking bread, her sous chefs tossing and catching their great spinning discs of dough, graceful and sure as dancers. After closing every night, Rishi would meet her at the kitchen door and walk her home, Kavya smelling of warm yeast, the two of them holding hands on the quiet sidewalk, watching other restaurants tuck themselves in for the night. All this time, she'd been living for the stolid delicacies of work and marriage, her tidy home, cocktail evenings, and yawning holidays. Her grown-up life was fat with pleasure, but after 3 years, then 4 and 5, the pleasure grew thin. She'd come to Berkeley to find herself, but found that herself was not enough. She wanted a self of herself. She wanted a child. So that's a little bit about Kavya, and as you heard from that, she and Rishi are trying to have children, and they can't, so that's how she eventually ends up with Soli's young boy. So to sort of connect that to Silicon Valley, there's this idea. I have a Silicon Valley section, but I won't read that out loud because I want to get to questions. There's this idea that I sort of discovered is prevalent in Silicon Valley, which is that nothing is impossible. If you think that something is impossible, it's just because you haven't put enough teams on the job. You haven't dedicated enough dollars and time to trying to work out the problem that you want to work out. And the question arises is of when you work in Silicon Valley like Rishi does, when this ethos is so wholly integrated into how you think, how do you apply that principle to your body? When your body won't produce a baby, no matter what you try, no matter what you do. And so that brings me to sort of wind this down. That brings me to the connections that I had to discover in this book. So those of you who are writers know when you start writing, especially with fiction, you don't think of all these connections and themes. Basically, you do whatever you can to get a story down. And you sit down every day and something happens, and then you end up with some words on a page, and you do this for a series of days and weeks and years, and you end up with, a story. And it's only later in the process that you start to see these connections and these themes. So a theme that I really started to discover eventually in my book was a theme of borders. So you have borders between countries, you have borders between possibility and impossibility. You have the borders that are set up by one's own body. And you have the borders between right and wrong and what we want and what we're allowed to have. And these sorts of dichotomies come into play again and again in my book. And one thing that I want to also put out to you today before taking questions is the idea of reading literature in our day and age, in this particular, set of years that we find ourselves in. I have been wondering, and a lot of my fiction writer friends have been thinking about the purpose of fiction in a time like the time we live in now, which can feel very overwhelming. The past few weeks have been especially overwhelming. So I feel like as a reader, the purpose of reading fiction is to bear witness to stories of people who don't necessarily live like us, who don't necessarily think like us or look like us. And as a writer, I think our duty is to write stories that we care about and to continue writing those stories. If there's one thing that we've learned from the election, if there's one thing that I learned, from the United Airlines fiasco last week, it's that if we don't write our stories and if we don't write the stories that we care about, someone else will. Someone else will tell that story for us, and they will probably have their own agenda behind it. So as writers, it's really important that we put our stories out there and we dedicate work to the things that we care about. And fiction is a part of the national conversation, and it always has been, and it always will be. And if we as writers stop speaking, and if we as readers stop listening, stop reading, the conversation is going to continue without us. And if we're not careful, it can morph into something that we don't recognize. It can morph into a language that we don't recognize anymore. So reading and writing, these are part of what we do as good, upstanding citizens. And I'd like to end it there. And I'm so grateful for Vikram and for the series for having me here and for all of you for coming out today. And thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. Yes?
You were talking about themes. When you started the book, did you have a big theme that you, in theory, wanted to stick to the story, and then when you started writing, all these other little themes started to show? Did you start with
No, I didn't really start with a theme. I started with curiosity, with being very intrigued by what someone like Soli had gone through, and I guess trying to find, if anything, if there was any sort of theme that I was maybe subconsciously thinking of, it was this idea that people can talk themselves into doing something that they normally would not condone. So with Encarnacion, this Guatemalan woman, the parents who adopted her child, they did it out of love, I'm convinced. They didn't do it out of malice. So I guess there's a theme there of people, saying to themselves what they need to say to justify what they want to do out of love, if that's a theme. Mm-hmm.
you said the publisher said no a few times.
Yeah.
What do you think shifted so that they started saying no?
So the question is, when I was submitting this, the publishers were saying no. What was it that made them say yes? I'm not entirely sure. I did change. So after my first round of rejections, I completely changed the ending. And then after my second and third round, I just kept working on it. And I added the Silicon Valley element later. I got rid of a character, I added a character, I made some connections. So it just became a simultaneously tighter and bigger book. It became more about California today and not just one woman's story. So, yeah. Yes. Anyone? You guys decide.
I'm very impressed by your eloquence and the thought you've given to the idea of borders and bringing the story back around to current events. And I guess I'm curious, what did you learn about yourself in writing this book? It sounds like a process, and I'm sure at times it was wrenching. It sounds like a blast to go to Mexico and do the research. But those lonely hours where you're staying and you're writing and you're thinking, and so at the end of this journey, what did you come away with?
So what did I learn about myself? One thing that I learned was that I could be very, very dedicated intellectually to something, which surprisingly was kind of a surprise. I say surprisingly because I'd done a PhD, so you'd think that I would maybe have felt that way before, but I was very, I stuck with this through rejection, through this mountain of research, through the daunting task of having to approach people that I'd never spoken to before, who had no idea who I was, and get them to talk to me. So as a writer, one thing I learned was that I was capable of doing this. So that's what I learned personally about myself. And then I learned a lot about the issue, and I learned how much I actually care about immigrants who are not like me. Yeah. Yes.
Naturally, my question kind of segues from hers.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious about taking a story. So you were listening to NPR, you hear the story, and then you're going off. I love what you said about finding the ordinary and the extraordinary. But I'm wondering about, I guess, the residual guilt you might feel of not being entirely loyal to the story itself as it is in truth, and how you kind of crossed over that obstacle to write the story that you wanted.
That I had. Yeah, so the question is whether I had any guilt about taking Encarnacion's story and not being completely faithful to it, because this is fiction and I sort of made up my own story. One thing I realized through just a little bit of research at the beginning was that this was not happening just to Encarnacion. It was happening to a lot of people, a lot of parents whose children ended up in foster care and who were not able to hold on to their children, hold on to custody of their children because they were in detention. So it became less Encarnacion's story and more something that was happening to a lot of people. So really what I had to do was find out, what actually happens to a lot of people. What is the standard method of having one's child adopted away from one, so to speak? So I didn't feel a lot of guilt because I realized that this is not one person's story. This is happening to a lot of people. And so I was able to move past it and just find out factually what was happening. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hi.
So, knowing you a little bit, there's a few nuggets in there that are succinctly autobiographical.
Are there?
And, like going to Comal for like a
Oh, right.
small
Yeah.
cocktail or something.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you could talk about, and I had read the first book too, which I don't know your childhood, but I that's full of
Yeah. Some stuff. Yeah.
How do you dance that line between it's a fictional character who's fully fleshed out, but then there's little bits of yourself in there?
So the question is, how do I balance creating a fictional character who feels full and also incorporating some of my own, impulses and biography? I think that in order to create a character, you have to understand them. You have to be able to feel what they're feeling. So by default, someone like Kavya, someone like Soli, they are essentially me. They're just different versions of me. Because I could create someone whose every impulse is completely different from my own. But I think even if I did that, I would still be in that person. So I don't hesitate too much to use bits of my life especially in Berkeley, because that's life in Berkeley. I happen to live in the place that I'm writing about, so it's kind of a gift to be allowed to make something as authentic as I can. I try not to go too overboard. My dad, with my first book, was very adamant, was really making sure that there was a clause in there about how this was not actually completely factual. There is always, it's like a legal thing that they put on the first page. But yeah. Other questions?
Speaking of cocktails,
Mm-hmm.
so I was having this dinner party and I happened to be down at Books Inc.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really, I love the title of your book, Lucky Boy.
Yeah,
And they created this Lucky Boy.
they did. Yeah.
And I ended up buying all the ingredients, but then I didn't make it.
Uh-huh. It's complicated.
I want to know, did you sanction this cocktail? Or?
Yeah, no, I didn't. Eric over there made it. He made a jug of it for me.
Okay, tell me, it's like all about soaking the fruit.
Yeah.
Getting the fecundity fruit all saturated.
Yeah. So for those of you who have no idea what anyone's talking about, Books Inc., which is a great independent bookstore chain in the Bay Area, they actually, unbeknownst to me, created a drink called the Lucky Boy Punch. And so they created this drink for my book. And it's one of the managers of the store who, I'd met him at an independent booksellers thing, and I guess he liked the book and he liked the idea of what was in there. So it uses mezcal, and it also uses a lot of sort of, Mexican and Indian fruit, mangoes. What else is in there? Just a lot of, yeah.
Like a mezcal sangria.
Yeah, like a mezcal sangria. So I didn't actually know that they were making it. A friend of mine texted that she saw it in the... I approve of it. It's very good. I was going to make it, and I found myself getting off BART. I had this party for some close friends the week that it came out. And I found myself getting off BART and faced with the prospect of making this cocktail. I was just so overwhelmed. I couldn't even imagine cutting a pineapple to make this thing. And then I texted Eric over there, and next thing I know, Eric had just made it. It was just done and made. So yeah, so I've never made it. I think it's way too complicated for my abilities and patience. But it's great. It's really good. It's worth it.
Did you bring any?
I did not bring any. More parties. Yeah. Yeah.
What's your next project?
My next project will be another novel. It's going to take a while. I haven't really even started it. I'm sort of at the stage where I'm trying to figure out what it's going to look like and, whether I'm excited about it enough. This one, Lucky Boy, just kind of, I heard it and it was this gift. It was just sort of dropped in my lap because I was excited about it. And I was just waiting to get started on it. But I feel not a lot of books start out that way. There's a lot of early grunt work where you're not sure if you like it and you just have to sort of stomach it and keep going until you decide one way or another. Yeah. Yes?
Did your publisher, Putnam, did they help you to take advantage of all the press when Trump got elected about undocumented people? Did they use all that media attention to promote your book, or
So the question is about my publicists at Putnam, at my publisher, and how they sort of leveraged the current era, the Trump era, and Trump's statements about immigration to promote my book. So I think it kind of worked the other way around. So they would send out, like they do for all their books, they send out press releases, they word things in a way to make it seem as relevant to the time as possible, no matter what your book is. And so usually what you bank on is that an editor at a magazine will read the press release and say, oh, well, that's really relevant, that's really current, let's look at this book. And so it more happened that way. So the editor did sort of draft these nice press releases that made it sound very current and very relevant to the headlines. And then it was up to the editors and people, on radio talk shows to pick this up and say, oh yeah, actually, I think we'll go with this. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Are you happy
With what they did?
lack of responsiveness?
Yeah, no, I mean, they did respond to it. I mean,
The editors of magazines did, but your publisher,
they did all the work to get it out to magazines. There's someone, like, I didn't do any of that, really. Like, they did all the, generating of these releases, and they knew all the people to send them to, and so they did all that. Yeah. So I was happy. Yes.
Kind of hooking on to that thought. Have you ever thought about how successful the launch of the book might have been if the election went the other way?
I have thought of that. So the question is about how successful the book launch may have been if the election had gone to Hillary Clinton. Yeah, I'm not quite sure of how to answer that. I think I can say this, right? I wish that the election had gone the other way. But I think, America, I think the American public would have we would have patted ourselves on the back, and we wouldn't have really addressed the problems that we have in this country. Now these problems are they're huge, they're towering above us, but we can at least see them, we're at least thinking about them. So I think maybe the book launch, it would have been a different thing. It would have still been relevant and interesting, but it wouldn't have had that sort of urgency that it has now. And I also, I'm realistic about my reach as a writer. As a novelist with a novel, I mean, what am I going to do? Am I going to go to detention centers and hand this to people and make them feel better? There's only so much that I can do with this book itself. It's now more about hoping that people will read it, people will care about the issue, people will be more aware of what undocumented immigrants go through. So, yeah. Yes?
In connection to that, do you have any resources or things that you found while doing research where people can get involved in immigration rights?
Yeah, there's lots that people could do. There is, let's see, what's going on. There's a group called Civic/End Isolation, and they have a program that goes into detention centers and sets up volunteers with detainees. So you'll be set up with someone who's in the detention center, you'll visit them every week, and you're just there sort of as a conversation partner, really, just someone to lend a sympathetic ear and talk about whatever the detainee wants to talk about. I trained a little with them. And what else is there? There's a group called Undocunation, and they do a lot of stuff on the art side of raising awareness. And there's the Asian Law Caucus, and there are various law groups that sort of handle the legal end of things. So, yeah. One more? Sure. Yes. Yeah.
After the book ends, have you thought of your characters' futures and kind of like a eventual sequel? Do you have that in your mind at all?
Yeah, I've thought of their futures. I mean, I don't want to give away too much of the ending. I have thought about what happens next for them. I've thought about it, in the immediate aftermath of this book, and I've thought about it far into the future. So that's all I'll say, because I don't want to give away the ending. Great. Okay, thank you so much, everyone.